Happening. We're going to pick up our speaker series because otherwise we're going to be here all night. And I know this is actually a nightclub, so we could in fact stay here all night if we wanted to, but I think at some point they actually will kick us out so their regular clientele can come back in. Thank you guys so much. So our next speaker is somebody who is very near and dear to my heart. He's actually somebody who doesn't even really need introduction because he's already introduced himself. Sorry. So I will be giving the next talk. Hi, nice to meet all of you guys. And I really appreciate you guys kind of giving me 10 to 15 minutes to talk a little bit about software factories, which is something that I have been nerding out about basically nonstop for the last month or 2 months or something like this. So I'm going to give you a quick intro. At the very beginning, I kind of mentioned, hey, I'm the CEO of Nori Agentic, and I said we're going to come back to that. This is the part where we come back to that, right? So what do we do at Nori? Nori is a software factory. That's something that you can think about. That's one way to think about what we do. We make it so that you can take your agents, put them in the cloud, and automate all of the grunt work out of your company. Whenever I give a talk, or whenever I listen to someone speak, I always ask myself, why this talk? And as a speaker, I feel like my job is to explain at least a little bit why I deserve 10 minutes of your time. And the short answer is, for the last couple of months, I felt like I have been seeing glimpses of the future. In order to understand that, I need to tell you a little bit about the story of Nori Agentic and how we got here. So Nori started its life as a lab where we were just trying to figure out what exactly it meant to run an AI native business. This is something a lot of people like to say, AI native business, right? And we didn't really know what that meant. I don't think anybody really knows what that meant. And so we just started playing around and building things. We built one of the first open source TUIs built on ACP. So that meant that you could use cross-provider, you could use Codex, you could use Claude, you could use whatever. We built a really powerful skills manager to let your whole team share and switch skills, which is really funny. These days, skill sprawl is becoming a big problem. And companies are like, we have thousands of skills and they're all crap. So we worked on that problem. And then we built a little bit of infra to run our agents in the cloud. And the reason we built that one is actually a little bit mundane. We would go out for lunch, we'd go get burritos and pizza, and we were all really annoyed that we had to close our laptops, right? We were like, wow, it kind of sucks that we have to close our laptops. It'd be really amazing if we could just keep talking to this thing on our phone. And so we built it not really expecting it to be much of anything, and unexpectedly, it totally transformed our company. We use cloud agents now to write 90% of our code. We use agents to write 100% of our code, but cloud agents specifically to write 90% of our code. We do almost all of our operations work, including sales and marketing, also using cloud agents. I think the only thing that we don't do with cloud agents is organizing events like this one, because you actually have to be here in person. I think people like to call this thing an AI employee, and I don't think it's an AI employee. I think it's more like an AI army. So I think this talk is important, and the reason I want to have 10 minutes of your time is because I want to try and bring the future into the present. My hope is at the end of this talk, you'll understand a little bit more of the art of the possible, how teams who are really at the frontier of using AI tools are changing their entire way that they do work in the space. So here's how we're going to accomplish that goal. First, we're going to talk a little bit about what a software factory is. Then we're going to do a deep dive on how to start building one. And then finally, we're going to share a little bit of scar tissue from 8 months of running what you could consider a software factory. So first of all, how many people have heard the term software factory? Okay, great. Yeah, it's kind of a term that's becoming a little bit more hypey on Twitter right now. What is a software factory? Well, the term actually was created in 1969 in operations research. And I think the idea was, wow, we actually really hate how these programmers with their long beards and their lack of suits are kind of so artisan about the way they write their code. What if we could actually replace them with a factory line? And that's not really what we're talking about. I think that was actually upstream of things like Agile and Waterfall and whatever. The term got repurposed earlier this year by a company called StrongDM. And in their blog post about the subject, they wrote that a software factory is a place where a human defines intent, what the system should do, the scenarios it needs to handle, and the constraints that matter. And after that, the agents just take over. The agents do all of the rest. They generate the code, they validate that it works, they iterate until it converges, and they do it without hand tuning and without any human review, right? So the point of a software factory, in some sense, at least as defined by StrongDM, is you pull the human out of the process of doing. You have your human on the left side of the wall, and you have the software factory on the right side of the wall. And the human just shoves a little script through a hole in the wall and then doesn't have to think about it. And it's kind of funny because, I say the history of this term, it's only been about 6 months, but already this term has just basically become a marketing term, right? The term is degraded. You'll talk to someone and you'll be like, they'll be like, I have a software factory, and you'll get all excited, and then it turns out that they're just running Claude code, and it's like, that's not a software factory, like, I'm sorry. But then there's this question, right? So you have all this hype that's kind of masking the thing. So what is a real software factory? Like, what does it actually mean? And this is kind of my core thesis, right? You'll know that you have a software factory when your company changes from being primarily reactive to primarily proactive. So what do I mean by that? Well, by default, when you use Claude or Codex or anything, it is fundamentally a reactive process, right? You have to put something into the system before it does anything. Let's say you're hungry, you have to go to Claude and be like, hey man, make me a sandwich, right? My thesis is that an effective software factory is proactive. It comes to you with the sandwich. It's like, hey, it's noon, I know you get hangry around this time, here's a sandwich, right? I made you this. This is the massive shift, right? The software factory is actually less about agents and more about the relationship between people and agents. The agents give me work to do instead of the other way around. And what are the impacts of this kind of a system? Well, we ship more, of course. I think we ship better, although our customers can maybe say a little bit about that. But the main thing I want to convey is how much this reduces my stress. If you set up your loops right, suddenly you're just on rails, right? You don't have to remember, oh shit, did I do that thing? The agents remind you, right? The agents are already in this system, in this autonomous loop that you are also part of. So hopefully I've convinced you that these things are worth building. How might you go about actually building it? Let's start with just a very simple automation, an agent that every single day at 9 a.m. gives me a summary in Slack of what happened in the company GitHub, right? This is not that hard to build. You can do this with a single EC2 instance and an agent API of choice. You could use Subconscious, you could use the Claude SDK, and then you just need some MCP integrations, right? You just have a GitHub MCP, you have a Slack MCP, and it's pretty straightforward. You don't actually have to do anything even in terms of like having an outward-facing server, because you can just run a cron job that every day at 9 a.m. kicks off that on the EC2 instance and tells the agent, hey, Amol's asking for a summary, please go post that in Slack, right? So pretty easy. The first time this happens, this is like a magical experience. And then you immediately go, okay, well great, let's add another, right? So let's say we want to add another automation. Maybe your product people are coming to you, they're coming to the tech team and they're like, we just always have these questions about the product. Can we get some sort of a QA system where people can ask questions about the product from Slack, right? Because they're not going to learn how to use a terminal, they're not going to like open Git or whatever, so it has to all live in Slack. All right, well, immediately there's a lot of interesting problems that pop up that didn't pop up with our first automation, right? Now we do need some kind of server, so you have to run some sort of a TypeScript thing in front of your EC2. You have to make sure that your EC2 instance is secure and can accept HTTPS requests and whatever. And what ends up happening is when a request comes in, it hits the server, and now the server is managing the lifecycle of your agent, right? So the server has a list somewhere of all of the agents that are running, and when the request comes in, the server goes, cool, I have this new request. Claude, here is the request, right? And actually, it's not quite that simple, right? Because the request actually needs to carry some information. You can't just have the agent just dump random things into Slack. It has to know who it's responding to. So your request needs to carry things like the channel and the root thread timestamp and a few other things, so the agent actually knows where to post a result. So all of that gets passed to the Claude Agent SDK. Claude looks at GitHub and Slack, which, by the way, we already built. We built that in our first automation, so luckily we can reuse some stuff. And then uses the channel and the thread timestamp to respond to the question. All right, so now you have two automations running, right? And this is starting to feel, wow, we're really getting something going. Let's add another one, right? Your team wants to know why every single time they talk to the agent in Slack, it doesn't remember the previous conversation. Right? They ask a question to the bot, and the bot responds, hey, yeah, here's what the product is about. And then they ask a follow-up, and the agent goes, I have no idea what you're talking about, right? So here's the problem. There is no state. So what if we want to make these conversations resumable? How would we do that? Well, one way to do this is you can add a database to your EC2 instance, right? So every time the server request comes in, it stores some sort of a unique ID into this database. And it doesn't have to be any big database. It can just be like SQLite or MySQL or something like that. So you have a UUID, maybe it's the Slack thread, timestamp, something like that. And when you call the agent SDK, it gives you some sort of a session ID. So you can map the Slack workspace, the channel, and the thread timestamp to the Claude session in this table that you've now created. And in the future, when a new request comes in, the first thing the server does is it checks that table, right? It says, okay, if the thread is already there, the server just resumes the Claude Agent SDK session instead of starting from scratch. All right, so now you have this EC2 instance, you have the SDK, you have the session table, you have these MCPs. By the way, this is actually a little bit more complicated than I'm making it out to be. Right now, we kind of assume that the Agent SDK is handling the full resume logic, but the SDK actually only handles the transcript. So what happens if like a file changes out from underneath you? Let's say you want to resume a session from like a month ago. Well, that's really annoying. The simplest way to handle something like that is you actually just bundle up the entire workspace. So you run a zip file on the entire folder where the agent is running, and then you store that in something like S3, and then you have to restore it whenever that session is required. So now you actually have two pieces of state. You have your session table, and you have this S3 bucket. Wow, things are starting to get complicated. Whoa, what the heck? Okay, there we go. All right, now the CTO is starting to get a little tired of this. Let's add another one. Let's say you want to automatically keep your docs up to date, right? So every day you want an agent to go through and make sure that all of the things that are externally facing match the internal repo. This is a very standard thing. It's something that people spend a lot of manpower on, actually, like a lot of manual hours. This is the first thing that we've tried to do here that is actually writing something, right? Everything thus far has been hopefully reading. The agent hasn't been making any changes. So now we need to make sure that if you have multiple agent requests, they're not going to step on each other. So one way to do that is to do something like a git work tree. How many of you guys know what a git work tree is? Yeah, okay, a lot of hands for that, right? But, so a git work tree is one way to basically say to the agent, okay, whenever you're making a change to this repo, I want you to basically isolate yourself and make sure that you're not making changes that other agents are going to step on. But realistically, you probably want a little bit more isolation than that, especially if you're doing something that actually requires, any amount of serious, you're touching anything that's like serious or goes into production. So maybe you end up setting up like an isolated folder or a complete sandbox, maybe even a modal sandbox. And we didn't talk about this before, but when you set up these sandboxes, you also have to inject least privileged credentials into these things, just so that they can actually go and access Git and make sure that the servers are fresh. And you have to make sure that all of your scopes were right, and so on and so forth. This is starting to look really terrible, isn't it? And if you just keep adding more, right, like you very quickly realize that this is quite a large product scope, right? So you have to ensure that like you have good scoping and RBAC. So your sales team, for example, isn't going to change things in your GitHub, and your GitHub isn't, and your engineering team isn't going to change things in Salesforce. You want to control cost and token budget. You might want to have multiple providers. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but Claude is going down like every other day, I feel like. So I often want to switch to Codex or something like that in the middle of the day. Maybe I want to build that in here. And it just goes on and on and on. So this is a little bit of the only part of my talk that I hope is just a little bit brief sales pitch. Most teams don't want to own all that crap. Get a vendor to do the boring stuff. QR code, that's what we do. We make it easy for you guys to focus on your software factory and not all of the plumbing that goes into this. So let's say you are now using Nori, or you've built your own software factory, right? And we do have some open source tools that we can also point to if you do want to go the build your own route. Let me share a bit of scar tissue of things that we've learned from 8 months of running our own software factory. So there are 3 big problems. If you zoom out a bit, there are 3 big problems that come with long-running factories. It's funny, actually, because they actually sound like problems that happen with real factories. First, you have noise, right? Your factory produces a bunch of garbage that you now have to sift through. The whole point of the factory is that it's going to move faster than a human. Well, guess what? If you have a bunch of stuff that's coming out that's faster than a human, somebody's got to have to take a look at that. And the agents are not perfect. They're pretty good, but they generally lack context. They might lack the capability to verify, or they just don't have any taste. I don't know if you guys have ever read a blog post written by Claude Code, but you can tell, right? So you got to make sure that somebody is looking at this stuff, especially just to make sure that it's not producing garbage. And so you want to make sure that the amount of time that you spend reviewing is not actually offsetting the amount of benefit that you're getting from your factory. Your factory will get worse over time. There is wear and tear. The agents do not like deleting things for some reason. So they will just keep on building up crap that gets loaded into their context window. And subconscious and stuff like that is awesome, right? But even then, you're eventually just going to have so much load that the agent kind of has to parse through so many files in its memory that it's going to end up slowing down and getting worse. And that destroys their context. They get dumber. And then finally, there's drift. You build a factory to build widgets, but tomorrow you need baubles, right? Building things is way less important than knowing what to build. And if you spent all of your time building all of this, like all of this hard-coded, then changing it is going to be a real pain in the ass. So how do you actually create a sustainable loop? Well, I have a lot of thoughts on this, but if there's a single massive piece of advice I have, it's this one. Don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. I think a lot of people want AI to do 100% of the work, right? That's kind of the original idea behind Strong DM. It says without human review. No, don't let that happen. Let the AI do what it's good at, which can be 95% of the work, and then put a human in the loop just to throw out the garbage, right? And by the way, that also includes things like agentic memory. If anybody's trying to sell you, hey, our agent will really remember things over a long period of time, be a little bit skeptical. I haven't really seen that work yet. I think a lot of agents that think they know what they want to remember, they generally have a pretty bad idea of what's actually worth remembering. A few other kinds of things that fall out of this, right? First, you shouldn't be afraid to split a long task into alternating AI and human steps. So as an example, we have a Twitter bot that scrapes Twitter every single day, and then it sends me in Slack a list of ICPs that I should go talk to. I am now part of that loop, right? So I know exactly what responses to write because nobody wants to get Claude slop in a Twitter response, and then I send that back to the agent. So it goes agent, me, agent, right? You should figure out what each person is good at and then put them in the loop at the right spots. You want to focus on your verification process. I'm not going to spend too long here. I think Rohan has a great talk later about verification. And then you want to think about high-level organization and swim lanes, right? You want to focus on things like which folder does the code go into, which is surprisingly important if you want to maintain long-term quality. And you should even have these little cleaner fish automations that go through your code base and make sure that those rules are being followed. And then at the team level, and this is maybe the most important thing for people who are kind of in engineering managers or who are founders or whatever, at the team level, somebody needs to own the factory, right? They need to keep it clean. They're responsible for making sure that automations don't leak state all over the rest of the company. I spend a lot of time thinking about the future. I guess that's part of the job of being a founder. When you use AI on your computer with you driving, I think it's really powerful. It's incredibly powerful, but it's also basically just a tool, right? It's mostly about moving in and around the existing structures in your company. You're writing code, you were writing code before, you're writing code now. Cloud agents, I feel like, are transformative to how a company works because they change the company structure. They change the relationship between the person and the technology. To me, this is a little bit like BlackBerry versus iPhone. The BlackBerry was an extremely powerful piece of technology that was stuck in the world of desktop computers. And the abstractions were all desktop abstractions, down to the clunky keyboard. An iPhone is about the same technology. It's not actually all that different. But the difference is that it's a mobile native experience. And that ended up transforming not just how we think about work, but how we relate to technology overall. And I think the same thing is true here. Agents on your laptop are powerful, like a BlackBerry is powerful. But agents in the cloud are transformative the way an iPhone is transformative. So that's all I got. Thank you so much for listening to my little TED Talk. I am actually going to hand this off to Cliff, who's my CTO, because I think it would be funny if I was asking myself Q&A questions. Thank you so much, everybody. And one really quick thing, that promo code is gone. If you type Agentics NYC into that QR code that was up there briefly, and we'll make sure that everybody gets this afterwards, you can get 1 more month free on your free trial if you try out Nori. So thanks so much.